Hello lovely people, the time has come to wrap up my non-fiction November reads.
This
is coming at you a little later than I would have liked, but life got busy. I had a really great time taking part in non-fiction November. I'm just going to dive into it with all the books that I read. I kicked it off with a brilliant choice. That was Pandora's Jar, Women in the Greek Myths by Natalie Haynes. I read this for the collection prompt because this is a collection of essays on different women from Greek mythology. I adored this. I've known for a while that Natalie Haynes is going to be a writer that I like. I decided to start with her non-fiction rather than her fiction, but I have now bought her fiction. This reminded me of the best lectures that I had while I was at university doing classical studies. It threw me back in time to that sense of excitement I had when I was starting to study this type of a topic in like an academic setting, which is not to say that it reads like an academic text. I think this is incredibly easy to read. I think she explores these figures from Greek mythology with an immense amount of knowledge, but also a sprinkling of humour. There's a lot of acknowledgement sometimes of how weird myths are, or like pointing out ironies of things and that kind of thing. She's essentially looking and tracing these figures from Greek mythology and kind of questioning some of the ideas we have about them and why we have these ideas, and essentially questioning the concept that these are things that are associated with them from the ancient sources we have. And she really takes you from those ancient sources a lot of the time up to contemporary times with this idea that we still have of these figures. It was absolutely wonderful. I harshly recommend it. This was a 5 out of 5 star read for me. It's one of the best books I've read this year, and it has set me on a Natalie Haynes reading path that I'm hoping to get a lot of joy out of. After that, I read The Paper Garden, Mrs. Delaney Begins Her Life's Work at 72 by Molly Peacock. I read this for the industry tag because Mrs. Delaney was an incredibly industrious woman. This is exploring Mary Delaney. She's famous because when she was 72, she started making these paper flowers. This is an example of them. This is one of her pieces of art. And they are botanically correct art pieces, but also almost like flower studies. She did an immense number of these. They're in museums all over the world. It really drew her to public attention. She became very good friends with the king and queen, stuff like this. But this tells you like her whole life, because she had an interesting life before she like found her life's work. And that's why I was interested in this, because I want to read more books that are about older women doing wonderful things, and just like a reminder that your life never stops at any time. You can go through 72 years before you discover the thing that makes you famous, and those 72 years can be full of other really interesting things. So Mary Delaney is someone that I think is so interesting. I have a real affection for her, having read this. This wasn't my favourite actual book. Part of that is because of Molly Peacock inserting herself into the narrative, and to be fair, it's only having read this book that I now know that there are books that are just biographies of Mary Delaney, and I think that would have been where I would have been better off. Molly Peacock is a poet. She tries to draw like parallels with her life and Mary Delaney's life in a very blunt manner. I just didn't think that her life was interesting enough to warrant the amount of presence that it had in this text. There were some interesting things about the structure of this. She sort of structures the chapters around different pieces of work, and sometimes that worked really well. Sometimes the way that she is interpreting these flowers and relating it to Mary Delaney's life was super interesting. Other times, to be honest, felt like a little bit of a stretch. So this is one where I think the subject of the text is so interesting. I didn't wholly love the execution of this, but I think I potentially would have been better off with some of the texts that I now know exist that are just like straight up biographies. After that, I read Belonging, the Autobiography by Alun Jones. This was another one I read for industry because I was interested in the rugby industry, and also he's been a very industrious player. He's played for a long time. I had a lot of fun with this. This was kind of a light relief book because the next ones that I read were a bit heavy, so I picked this one up because I knew that it would be just lovely. I didn't know Alun Jones. I didn't know that much about his life before this, so it was really interesting to get a sense of his roots, where he's from, like how much rugby has had a role in his life. He seems extremely focused and driven, which makes a lot of sense to me. You don't become the captain of the Welsh rugby squad if you're not in some ways focused and driven. But he also seems quite down to earth, which I liked. There's like a self-awareness here of when his life is in some ways like ridiculously brilliant, and then also there were a lot of moments in this that really touched me. Like he talks about the passing of his father, and I found that very emotional to read. Um, so I didn't expect this one to be like an absolute masterpiece of writing, but for what it is, I thought it was very well done. I've definitely come away with a much better understanding of the rugby industry, both in regards to the clubs he played for, and then playing for Wales and playing for the Lions squad and that kind of thing. So I've just had a lovely time, and I've come away with a lot of affection for the man. The big book that I was reading at the time was Empress Dowager Cixi by Zhang. I just want to make a tiny note that I think I've been mispronouncing her name every time I've mentioned her because I was going by the Wade Giles, not the Pinion pronunciation. I'm probably still saying it not correctly. I'm very sorry. I have been trying to research. If you have any recommendations or like can point me in the direction of where I need to look to make sure that I am saying this correctly, please do let me know. This is the second of her books that I've read. The first one was Wild Swans, which is her hugely famous sort of biography of 3 generations of women in her family, including herself, which was very, very interesting. I really liked the way it was written, and I thought I would pick this up because I don't really know a lot of Chinese history, and I know that I like how she writes, so I thought this would be a great next place to go. This was interesting, and I learned a whole lot that was really super interesting, because this is a period of history that I don't know anything about. It's a chunky book, because she goes into a lot of detail. If I have one critique of this book, it's that I think at times she is very obviously biased in favour of the Empress Dowager. I liked what this book was setting out to do, which was sort of, again, kind of similar to the Pandora's Jar, challenging the idea that we have of this historical figure, because the idea that we have is not always reflective of some of the realities. Like, I do think that based on what she has said in this book, like, some of the ideas we have around this woman are not necessarily wholly correct based on her actual actions. That said, she spends a lot of time defending her against some of these things that are wheeled out against her and her character and that kind of thing, but then very quickly skims over some of the bad things that she does. For example, like one sentence is describing the concubine that she threw down a well, and again the decision to bump off her adopted son, again very casually skimmed over. So I definitely learnt a lot reading this book, and I found it very readable in many ways. It was really interesting to get an understanding of a period of history that I've not known anything about previously. This is not an unbiased account. It's hard to write an unbiased account, to be fair, but this one I think occasionally it became very clear to me, and I don't know anything, that some of this was a bit tinged by her own admiration for this figure. You know, what is it, girl boss gatekeep? I can't remember the phrase, but I felt a bit like that. Where it's you don't have to spin someone into a feminist icon to acknowledge when they've done stuff that is worthy of acknowledgement and remembrance. You know, she doesn't have to be like a girl boss. A book that was not on my TBR but that I read because of that is I thought it would be interesting to read Hong Kong, Epilogue to an Empire by Jan Morris, because this is this briefly mentions when Hong Kong was sort of signed over to the British under that lease kind of thing. But it didn't really go into it in a lot of depth. But also this is a Chinese perspective on that moment in history. This is Jan Morris, who is a Anglo-Welsh writer who epilogue to an empire. So Jan Morris spent time in Hong Kong when she was in the army, and this was in the lead up to Hong Kong being handed back. So a lot of this is looking at the history of Hong Kong, and then also what might Hong Kong look like in the future. Obviously, I'm existing in the future, so I do know what happened. And there has been a lot of political unrest in Hong Kong recently. So it was really interesting to read this to get an understanding of some of what has led into the current political moment that we are in. This is definitely a British perspective on the history. There is a lot of focus on stuff like Britain's presence in Hong Kong and how it has changed it, and a lot of the historical events are sort of told from that kind of a perspective rather than necessarily a native Hong Kong person's perspective, that kind of thing. This was not always my favourite. Some sections of this I found so interesting, and others I was not super interested in. And I think it's testament to the fact that Jan Morris is really exploring a whole range of different topics, and each one that she explores, she goes through in a lot of depth. So if you're interested in that particular topic, it's great because you get so much information. If that's one of the topics that's not so interesting to you, then that particular section is a bit dull. So definitely a very interesting read, and I am glad to have read it. It's not my favourite Jan Morris, and it's not necessarily where I'd recommend starting with Jan Morris, but these two books in conversation with each other did serve for quite a compelling reading experience in harmony, if that makes sense. The next book I read was Spirals in Time, The Secret Life and Curious Afterlife of Seashells by Helen Scales. This was an impulse buy from a charity shop because I just thought it sounded interesting, and I found it absolutely fascinating. I had such a cool time with this. I have so many feelings. Mollusks are weird, hermit crabs are adorable. This goes through so much to do with shells. It's looking at the creatures who live in the shells, so we have a whole thing about like mollusks, how did they develop over time and prehistory and that kind of thing. We have stuff like how are shells made. Also a lot of stuff to do like culturally, like what role have shells had in culture. Like there are cultures where shells were used instead of as a form of currency. Anything you could think of to do with a shell is explored in this book, and I think sometimes these books either like work or don't work based on how interesting do you actually find the subject and how are they written. I found this to be written in a way that was really easily accessible. Like she's exploring a lot of topics that I don't really know anything about, but at no point did I feel very lost. I always felt like on top of what she was saying, even when she's exploring like all of these different things. And I did find it absolutely fascinating. I've come away with all of these like feelings about shells and the creatures who live within them. And I think it did what it wanted to do very, very well. And so I had a really lovely time reading it. And if you're someone who enjoys these books that explore topics to do with the natural world, this is one that I definitely would recommend. The final book I read was The First Ladies of Rome, The Women Behind the Caesars by Annelise Freisenbruch. I had another really fab time with this. I read some really good books for Non-Fiction November, guys. This is doing, again, a very similar thing where we're looking at women in history that have not necessarily been given the spotlight, or who we have these ideas of that may not be wholly accurate. This goes through the entire, like, Roman dynasty. I felt very comfortable when we were going through, like, the Julio-Claudian sort of aspect of it. Like the women who are associated with that time I already feel quite familiar with. It was interesting to get some of my assumptions about them challenged and to be like, okay, well, where are the sources of these opinions that we have of them? What do we actually know about them and the actions that they actually did? I found it really fascinating as we came through the Roman Empire, especially as we got to more the point where it became more Christianized, because I don't really know anything about both the emperors and also the women in their lives. So this is definitely one that has introduced me to a lot of Roman history that I didn't know, which is why I wanted to read it, because I don't feel very confident on my Roman history knowledge. So I really appreciated that. I found it really interesting. There were some chapters that were definitely stronger than others. I felt like this book started off really strong. I think some of them none of them were bad. It's just there were some chapters that did feel a bit weaker than others did. But on the whole, if you're someone who, like me, wants to get a better understanding of Roman history, or even if you're someone who is quite up on Roman history but wants to have some of these ideas of these women that we have challenged, this is another one that I would absolutely recommend. So that is everything I read for Non-Fiction November this year. I would really love to hear your thoughts if you've read any of these, or if you haven't, let me know your thoughts, please do. Also, what is the best book that you read for Non-Fiction November this year, or just your favourite non-fiction book in general? I am always looking for recommendations, because I can squirrel them away and have a glorious November every year. But yeah, I had a really fabulous time, if that's not obvious. And I loved a lot of these books. So that's everything I wanted to talk about today. I hope you have a really lovely day. I will see you next time for something different.